Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of the new National Climate Assessment Roundtable series. My name is Larry Perez, part of the Climate Change Response Program for the National Park Service based in Fort Collins, Colorado. I want to begin right off the bat letting you know that today's roundtable is going to be live captioned with the kind assistance of Fed Relay. So if you'd like to take advantage of that captioning, just use the link that you'll find in your chat box right now. The Roundtable series you are attending is intended to deliver area-specific information on the units of the National Park System within each of the 10 National Climate Assessment regions. The Roundtables are valuable opportunities to learn about the latest findings from the 2018 assessment, ask questions of subject matter experts, and have a dialogue with NPS leaders that are actively working on climate change issues in their parks. So today we really encourage your participation. Today's roundtable will focus squarely on parks within the U.S. Caribbean region of the assessment. If you happen to be calling in from a park outside the area, that's okay. We still very much welcome your participation today. Just know that previous installments of the series focused on additional regions throughout the country. Recordings of all past events in the series can be found using the link that we're going to post in the chat box as well. As part of today's call, we're going to be hearing shortly from Ernesto Diaz on findings, impacts, and actions from the 4th National Climate Assessment, followed by a brief Q&A session. We'll then have some short presentations from several invited guests from parks within the Caribbean region, and we'll shoot to conclude the broadcast shortly after 2 p.m. Eastern Time today. I'm going to be one of two facilitators on today's roundtable. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Matt Hawley, who's going to be helping us manage our technology today. And speaking of the tech, just a few quick words before we begin. All the functionality of the webinar interface is accessed through this tiny toolbar. If the panels are not already visible, you can access them by clicking on the right arrow button at the top of the toolbar. Be aware your panels may minimize periodically by default, but you can set them to remain open just by clicking on View along the top menu and deselecting the Auto Hide option. The audio panel shows you how you're currently connected to the webinar. For best quality, we highly recommend that you dial in via phone rather than using your computer audio. If you're currently connected via computer audio, you're welcome to switch over to phone audio at this time by selecting the phone radio button and just dialing in. We have quite a few participants on the line with us today, so by default, all participants are muted just to keep background noise in check. We will, though, be taking questions during the entirety of today's roundtable. Again, these roundtables are golden opportunities to ask questions of our invited experts and practitioners relative to the work and challenges you face within your park. So we really encourage you and welcome you to bring your voice into the room. And there are two ways to do so today. If you have a question you'd like to voice during the webinar, simply find the raise your hand icon on the webinar interface, and we'll unmute you one by one to ask your questions. And just so everyone gets familiar with that functionality, I'd like to ask everyone listening right now to raise their hand at this time.
One hand raised, 2, 3. Oh, they're coming in fast and furious, Larry. We've got over half have already raised their hands. This is one of the most on-the-ball groups we've ever had.
I agree. So great. You all know where the button is. Feel free to use that at any point in time during today's roundtable. Matt will go ahead and lower your hands from our end. In addition to asking questions verbally, you're also welcome to submit written questions at any time. To do so, just enter your text into the questions panel that you see here. Matt and I are going to monitor for incoming questions and pose them to our speakers and panelists at the very first opportunity that we get. And additionally, should you have any difficulty with the text today, you can use this same questions panel to just let Matt and I know in the background. Finally, be aware that this live session is being recorded for your future reference and sharing online. So with that, I'd really like to get started. I am very, very happy to welcome Mr. Ernesto Diaz as our featured speaker today. Ernesto has served as coordinator of the Puerto Rico Climate Change Council since its creation in 2009. Publishing the first State of Puerto Rico Climate Change Report in 2014 and co-leading the first standalone chapter for the U.S. Caribbean as part of the 4th National Climate Assessment. Ernesto has previously served as co-coordinator of the United Nations Environment Program, Coastal Management Project, for 13 states and territories of the Caribbean region. He currently works on multiple coral reef, beaches, dunes, and wetlands restoration, enhancement, and hybrid engineering with nature interventions in Puerto Rico. So Ernesto, thank you very much for taking the time today, and we've given you control to take it away at your leisure.
Right. Thank you, Larry, and thanks to the colleagues from the National Park Service for inviting us to share part of the work that we conduct as members of the Department of Natural Resources of Puerto Rico. And I also serve as a director and coordinator of the Puerto Rico Coastal Management Program and the Puerto Rico Climate Change Council. So today I'm going to be talking about what the Puerto Rico Climate Change Council constitutes and does. Will be presenting, and it'll be the source of most of our trends and projections, the results of the National Climate Assessment chapter, first ever standalone chapter for the U.S. Caribbean. I'll be discussing briefly some effects and impacts on coastal communities, critical infrastructure, and natural assets. And I'll be highlighting some ecosystem services, particularly using as a reference the coral reefs, and we'll be making some recommendations in terms of the next generation of coastal infrastructure and hopefully some systemic interventions. So the Puerto Rico Climate Change Council is a voluntary association with a membership of over 150 colleagues, scientists, planners, engineers, doctors in medical science, communicators that collectively assess the state of Puerto Rico's climate using the best science and knowledge available to understand Puerto Rico's social ecological vulnerabilities and to develop adaptation strategies and build a resilient society. That's our mission. So representatives from all of these federal and Commonwealth agencies, as well as private and public universities, not-for-profit organizations and the private sector, as well as independent researchers, collaborate through 4 different working groups. The one that assesses the geophysical and chemical scientific knowledge, and that information is then referred to 2 other groups that assess effects and impacts, trends and projections in terms of the ecology and biodiversity and how those changes affect these systems, as well as in society and economy. Then that information is converted into reports and guidances, as well as multiple forms of public outreach and education. Most of them are published at the Puerto Rico Climate Change Council web portal, as well as other outlets. So in 2014, we published our first ever State of the Climate report. Then we developed, based on those findings, guidance in the form of a guide of strategies for the Puerto Rico level, Puerto Rico-wide kind of recommendations, the municipal, home, and individual, what we could do to adapt to climate change in Puerto Rico, and it was entitled Road to Resilience. Then in 2018, even though we started in 2017, just before Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico and other islands in the Caribbean, we started working on the chapter for the U.S. Caribbean with colleagues from the USVI and other partners from NOAA, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, that were wonderful at guiding us through the process. So we published this chapter that we're very proud of, and is what I'm going to be using as a reference to discuss the trends and projections in terms of climate and other oceanic changes that we're observing. So the chapter has an executive summary, obviously some background, particularly the science, because some of the science for Puerto Rico and the USVI were not included in the Special Climate Science Report of the National Climate Assessment, but we were allowed to provide some additional science as part of our background, and we provide, as part of this chapter, the observed and projected climate change in terms of temperature, precipitation, sea surface temperature, ocean acidification, and sea level rise. We developed 6 key messages that highlight the links between observed climate change and regional risks, as well as some future climate change projections, and some challenges and opportunities and success stories for reducing risks, as well as some emerging issues, particularly those related or pertaining to data sharing and collaboration. In islands, obviously, we have additional constraints because of the isolation of our jurisdictions. It is very important, and this is something that we worked at under the guidance of the colleagues from the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the traceable accounts, and how we were to use this information that was, sustained or supported by the peer-reviewed references that we also highlight as part of the report. So that's the content of the chapter. But obviously, there are some concerning drivers of change that we follow closely and for which we have very little influence to make change, particularly here in Puerto Rico, even though we have the moral and ethical responsibility as citizens of this world. World population already surpassed 7 billion and is expected to reach between 8 and 10 billion by 2050. In Puerto Rico, there are only 3.2 million people. So we are the first one facing, as small islands, the effects and impacts of climate change, but we cannot do much to curb down CO2 and greenhouse gases emissions. On the upper right-hand corner of your slides, you'll see how for the previous 800,000 years, we hadn't exceeded the 300 part per million concentration of CO2, atmospheric CO2, but we are skyrocketing and already surpassed 400 parts per million. And here at La Parguera, which is our marine sciences the department location, we have measured up to above 410, and we'll have larger cities or industries nearby. So it's a regional and global issue. And population is not distributed homogeneously throughout the world. So 40% of the population live in coastal areas, 54% live in cities, where 70% of the energy is consumed and 75% of the greenhouse gases are emitted. And it is expected that 68% of the population, world population, will live in cities by 2050. So on the mitigation side, I think that this is an area that we should target in terms of energy transformation and responsible energy consumption practices. This is an interesting graph that was put out by Dr. Stefan Ramstorff of the Potsdam Institute a couple of weeks ago. I found it very interesting because it shows the strong correlation between an atmospheric temperature increase and how the trends, historic trends, and sea level rise, and how, and I'm going to highlight 2 specific points in time in this graph, how for increase of 1 degree centigrade around 10,000 years ago, it took about 1,100 years for that to occur. And on the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that in the past 100 years, the temperature, atmospheric temperature has increased 1 degree centigrade. So that's a tremendous concern that obviously last week, the meetings in Madrid, COP25, it should be discussing this and how we address this issue as an emergency, as a crisis. In Puerto Rico, coastal leases and assets at risk are large because 61% of our population live in the 44 coastal municipalities. Most of the economy, 70% of the economy takes there. We have housing, all of our airports and ports, thousands of miles of primary roads, bridges, culverts, hospitals, schools. All of our power generation systems are within 1 kilometer of the coastline. Fiber optic cables, all the communications are vulnerable to sea level rise and other coastal related changes. Water infrastructure and natural and cultural assets at risk. And this is a couple of pictures of the stats that I'm presenting. So there is a high density development, a lot of critical infrastructure developed at very low elevation above mean sea level. So this is part of what we reported in the National Climate Assessment, Chapter 20. And the precipitation for Perico and USVI is expected to decrease by at least 10% by 2050. So Perico has a better correlation with the maps that are presented because of the larger landmass. But for USVI, there needs to be a more refined or downscaled type of a modeling. I'll be using, as I mentioned, coral reefs as the center of the presentation from now on. And coral reefs, in addition to being beautiful and diverse and important from the ecological standpoint, the structural complexity, particularly in the shallower areas, it provides a great shelter to our coastal communities and infrastructure, critical infrastructure. And I'll be showing in more detail what I'm talking about. But corals are very sensitive to ocean chemistry changes. So we mentioned that we're approaching a dangerous threshold here, where increased sea surface temperature as well as ocean acidification threaten to affect the integrity of coral systems throughout the world. And we are seeing that. In fact, we're in the 13th week of a very anomalous sea surface temperature increase that has triggered massive bleaching, in addition to making these systems more sensitive to diseases such as stony coral tissue loss disease that Florida have been working hard at trying to detect what the pathogen is and how to treat it. So USVI already has the disease and in their waters, and it seems like in Perico has been recently reported soon. So in this graph of the National Climate Assessment Report, in our Chapter 20, we also highlight, based on data from Magueyes at La Parguera, the strong correlation between CO2 concentration, the top line on the graph, and then the decrease in pH, the blue line in the center of the graph, and then the increase in sea surface temperature. In terms of sea level rise, we use the NOAA and Army Corps of Engineers calculator to develop this, but then Dr. William Sweet, Billy, helped us fine-tune the projections. So we're expecting an intermediate low in sea level rise increase of close to 2 feet. An intermediate scenario by 2100 would be between 3 and 4 feet. And one extreme scenario that obviously, if we continue business as usual, we might get to see, hopefully we don't, is 9 to 11 feet as the extreme scenario. And heat increase in sea surface temperatures and heat storage in the ocean surface triggers also more intense hurricanes, and that's what we saw in 2017 when we had the most active Atlantic hurricane season in record. So we're seeing, and the statistics reflect that. Jim Cousin from NOAA also was a colleague participating in our chapter and helping us with those stats and analysis. Presents that hurricanes are, in terms of the recent trends, are slower in motion, but more potent in intensity. And that's a dangerous combination that we have seen with hurricanes Irma, Maria, and more recently with Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas. Obviously, we had Sandy and Katrina in the past, so that's a dangerous trend that we're observing in terms of extreme events, and that we should adapt and prepare for. This is what we found immediately after Hurricane Maria. I assembled two teams, and because we didn't have any power or internet, I personally was without power for 34 days, but that's nothing compared to people that were without power for close to a year, 11 months. So we saw many mangrove systems that really drowned with a 6 feet storm surge and waves that reach up to 34 feet. And those systems that couldn't flush out the salt water, it really collapsed under those inundation conditions. So we have several sites where we have a massive mortality of mangroves. And this is in terms of infrastructure, the type of infrastructure damage that we got to see during our inspections. It was terrible, particularly for the northeast, northern, and western portions. Southern side, the Caribbean side of Puerto Rico, was in a relative better condition. So I'm showing here an image of the San Juan metro area, where we can see some clouds north of the coastline, and that's where the coral reef barrier is at. And this area, fortunately, even though it was flooded, was protected by the coral reefs. These corals were able to attenuate 97% of the wave energy. We had significant wave heights of close to 24 feet. And remember that the significant wave height is the average of the upper third of the total waves that we received. But some waves were measured at 34 feet, the maximum wave heights. So what we're presenting to FEMA is the request to restore, improve, and enhance, and even build hybrid infrastructures to fill some gaps in order to provide this type of wave attenuation offshore and avoiding hardening the shoreline and investing in protection immediate to the infrastructure. So coral reefs during these hurricanes were able to avert the cost of a great disaster that was bound to occur. So that's a part of my message, is that we need to continue investing in natural systems such as wetlands, beaches, and dunes, and obviously the coral reefs as being the first line of defense of these areas. So as part of our work, we continue trying to get the best science into land use plans, zoning regulations, and building codes based on we have 1,225 beaches, and we know the erosion trends for each one of those. So what we're proposing is to develop a coastal construction line that takes into account the erosion rates plus the sea level rise trends, and try to come up with a spatial planning area for adaptation, even though we'll have to continue fine-tuning our modeling because not all systems will respond homogeneously throughout the whole shoreline. If colleagues from the engineering department at the University of Puerto Rico at Maya West have made some calculations in terms of how increasing freeboard requirements would, even though it would increase slightly the cost of the units that are built in these flood-prone areas, the avertment of damages because of the increased height in above the base flood elevation would be tremendous. So a 3% increase in the cost of an infrastructure may bring you from protecting your property from 100 years floods to 500 years floods, and that's an interesting approach that we're trying to present to FEMA, the Perico Planning Board, as well as colleagues in the Army Corps of Engineers and those determining how we build in those areas that are sensitive or potentially affected by floods. Adaptive design refers to recognizing that even though it is not a requirement, nor by regulations or building codes, that if you have a projection that sea level rise or storms or other type of extreme events may affect your property, you should leave it retrofit ready to adapt to future or changing scenarios. And that's something that we need to continue conveying. And we have requested FEMA to include our modeling as part of their firm maps, the flood insurance rate maps, so that that information is there as non-FEMA information, but people can make informed decisions about how to invest in these areas. So, as I mentioned, the new generation of Caribbean infrastructure, I would say, or coastal areas infrastructure should include hybrid and nature-based alternatives in those areas, tropical areas where we have coral reefs. We need to intervene to try to get resilient strands and increase sexual reproduction of these corals so that we increase the diversity and the potential opportunities for these systems to adapt to changing conditions and disease. Wetlands and beach nourishment are part of our portfolio of interventions. Taller dunes definitely is something that will always foster and try to stabilize. And typically when we talk to FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, they're not highly sensitive to these recommendations because of the benefit cost analysis. But if we reframe the way the analysis and the interpretation of the benefits and costs are considered under particularly FEMA and Army Corps of Engineers methods, we could find that hybrid and nature-based alternatives have a lower or similar cost. They can have a rapid return on investment, and definitely they do have a lower operations and maintenance, which in cases like Puerto Rico, where we have a fiscal crisis right now, funding for maintenance is always scarce. So we also can get a longer design life. They are definitely more aesthetically attractive and have additional tourism and recreation benefits. So I think that we need to continue working with FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers in terms of recognizing these benefits that are taken for granted when we talk about this natural infrastructure. So there is, in the case of Puerto Rico and the USVI, a recovery process going on after Hurricanes Irma, and we need to build to be more resilient and not to pre-disaster conditions. So this is a great opportunity for us in the islands and also in Florida because of Hurricanes Michael and Florence are also, and Texas also has Harvey. I think that we should join efforts to try to present this type of recommendations and wherever possible, mitigation or pre-disaster projects, as well as those with public assistance, should seek to consider regional, larger scale approaches and working to use this type of hybrid and nature-based infrastructure as a part of their portfolio for recovery. I have Swiss Re, which is a reinsurance company, because I think that from the private sector, they are already recognizing these ecosystem services, and they are, for example, in the case of Mexico, insuring and developing products and some parametric products to allow for the investment on the repair, protection, and maintenance of these systems because of the cost aversion of future disasters. So with that, I think that I'm reaching my last slide, and that's the recommended citation of our report. So thank you very much for enabling us to present this information about the U.S. Caribbean, and particularly focusing in Puerto Rico.
Ernesto, thank you so much. So much you're grappling with right now in Puerto Rico, and so much to talk about relative to what you've been discussing in your presentation. Before we move on, I want to open things up for any questions we might have from the audience. This is a brief period of Q&A. Matt, how are we looking on questions right now?
We have one that's come in so far, and from Dan. And Dan, I'm going to try to put you on the spot. I see you're connected by telephone. What I'd like to do is unmute your phone so you're able to ask this question for Ernesto verbally. Dan, are you there to ask your question?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Go for it.
There was a paper that just came out today in Nature that's sort of a consensus estimate of changes in the mass balance of the Greenland ice sheet. And the clear conclusion is that the Greenland ice sheet is losing mass much more rapidly than anticipated, putting it in line with the higher or the worst sea level rise projection in the IPCC assessment. And so I guess my question is, if the worst case scenario is now kind of the middle scenario and we need to come up with a new worst case scenario, what should folks in parks and the staff of parks who may be tuning into this webinar be doing differently than they're doing now, or doing differently than they would have been doing under the previous scenario?
So I haven't read the paper, but I've been hearing a lot about this, the acceleration on the loss of permafrost, glaciers, and the Greenland ice sheet is tremendously concerning, because obviously we're not prepared for it. Coastal areas, Miami Beach or San Juan or Myanmar or other parts of the world, Hong Kong, we're not prepared for this. And the option of adapting vertically or protecting would demand tremendous investments. Retreat, if planned, could be an option, but we should treat the risk or the trend as an emergency and not wait until the last minute, because otherwise we won't be able to adapt, and we will have a lot of climate refugees worldwide. So those are really concerning data and information that you are putting in front of us, and this paper it should be opening the eyes of decision makers worldwide.
Excellent. Thank you for your question, Dan. I really appreciate it. Ernesto has graciously agreed to stay on with us for the balance of today's call. So as we kick off our Caribbean Parks panel discussion, I just really want to remind and encourage everyone to send in your questions for any of our speakers as you think of them, and we will raise them at the first opportunity. And again, you can do that by raising your hand or by just populating the questions panel. So Ernesto, hang tight. I'd like to introduce our first panel member, Mr. Matt Patterson. Matt is a marine ecologist who has spent the past 25 years studying the marine ecosystems of South Florida, with a specific focus on coral reefs. He's been working for the National Park Service since April of 2000 in a number of different roles, and is currently the senior marine ecologist for Everglades and Dry Tortugas National Parks. He has documented firsthand how climate change impacts have been detrimental to live stony coral cover in both South Florida and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and is currently working on a coral restoration plan for Dry Tortugas National Park. Matt, thanks very much for joining us today. Go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Larry. Can you see my screen?
Sure can.
Okay. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Again, my name is Matt Patterson, and I've got 16 slides to go over in 5 minutes, so I'm going to go quick and hopefully tell you a little bit about what's going on in Dry Tortugas and Virgin Islands National Parks with regard to sea level rise and climate change. The first few graphics I've got are based from a technical report that some of my colleagues here at Everglades put together in 2016. The reference is down there at the bottom left. and it was a simulation of inundation due to sea level rise, looking at the IPCC RA5 or AR5 report, looking at the RCP 6.0 as the low and the RCP 8.5 as the high, which now may be the new based on what we just heard from Dan. The picture on the top right is an aerial photograph of Garden Key showing Fort Jefferson, a Civil War era 3-story brick fortress out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, 70 miles west of Key West. The two images below that are the low scenario and high scenario inundation graphics, the gray being what's exposed. And so by 2075, the ferry may arrive at Dry Tortugas National Park full of visitors that will then have to snorkel into the fort to see it. The additional island in Dry Tortugas that has infrastructure is Loggerhead Key, just to its west. Same sort of scenario, either by 2075 or 2100, the anticipation of the entire island pretty much being submerged or inundated is what they project, and you can kind of see the lighthouse is that gray dot in the bottom right picture sticking up out of the water. In addition to wondering what's going to happen with sea level rise, we've been tracking the fate of Stony Corals in Dry Tortugas for the past 2 decades roughly, and it hasn't been a happy story. Generally a trend in loss of live stony coral cover over time, and this has been primarily due to coral bleaching, coral disease, and some hurricane impacts. And right now we're poised to watch what may potentially happen as the stony coral rapid tissue loss disease that Ernesto spoke of is now 15 miles east of the park boundary and has been moving slowly since 2014 from Miami down the reef tract, decimating the reef building corals that make up the Florida Keys Reef. And we're waiting to see if that will impact the corals within the park that are still alive. So stay tuned on that story. Moving 1,100 miles to the southeast, the next group of slides are created by Jeff Miller, fisheries biologist for the South Florida and Caribbean Inventory and Monitoring Network. And it's a 30-year progression of stony coral history of several fixed monitoring sites around St. John at Virgin Islands National Park. It started the story with 2 major hurricanes that hit St. John, Hurricane Hugo and Hurricane Marilyn, that both took out quite a bit of stony coral cover. And then in 1998, there was a bleaching event that also reduced stony coral cover by about 30%. Bleaching is when the water temperatures exceed 29.5 degrees Celsius, and what looks like a healthy coral reef on the left turns stark white as the zooxanthellae symbiont is released from the coral animal tissue and makes the coral animal basically translucent, and you see the calcium carbonate skeleton through its tissues. Not always fatal, but definitely stressful, and it can cause coral mortality if it's an extended bleaching event. After that event, for several years, things were hurricane-free, bleaching-free, up until 2005, 2006. At that point, we had a major bleaching event that was then documented very well by Jeff Miller and colleagues, which, as the bleaching recovered in late winter, late fall, early winter, the stressed corals then were prone to being attacked by a coral disease, which wiped out about 2/3 of the living stony coral cover that was on the monitoring sites, all in 1 year. And it was really the first time that this 1-2 punch had been fully documented. The corals just are basically eaten alive by this disease, leaving just a dead skeleton graveyard. After that, another series of years of very slow growth. Corals are extremely slow growing animals, taking centuries to develop into the multi-meter sized big coral heads that sometimes you can see still alive. And in 2010, Hurricane Omar actually offset a bleaching trend by although it was a hurricane, it was a Cat 1 hurricane, not a ferocious one, coming across the island, shading the waters and bringing up deep cold water, upwelling it onto the reef tract, which basically then reset that temperature gain of the waters around the island back to more comfortable levels for the corals. And then, of course, 2017, we had Hurricane Irma and Maria, which definitely whacked St. John dramatically. Although it hit the island dead on pretty much, the stony coral cover loss was not significant. There was damage to many of the reefs, especially areas that could be easily fractured from bioerosion. But sponge cover was decimated. Sponges are soft-bodied animals living on the reef and are easily ripped off the reef with storm surge or heavy wave action. And when the sponges are taken away, the macroalgae is allowed to come in and fill in those gaps, reducing areas for the stony corals to continue to grow. So that's kind of the stony coral story. As you can see, it's been a decrease with, several bouts of trying to recover, whacked by an additional new, hurricane or bleaching event. Moving into temperature and sea level or sea temperature change, the reefs that are monitored in the South Florida Caribbean network are also monitored for temperature at the reef level. So not sea surface temperature, but what's going on at where the animal lives. And as you can see from this graphic, that over the last 3 decades, the years where we saw temperatures above that 29.5 degrees Celsius bleaching threshold have increased dramatically from 4 out of 10 up to 9 out of 10. So we imagine that in the future, as climate change and global warming continues, we're going to see that as a additional stress for the corals to have to deal with as they try to grow. And that's all I've got.
Well, that was pretty darn good, Dave. Thank you very much for doing that. I really appreciate it. And I know, Matt, you've got to go ahead and boogie out of here fairly quickly. So thank you very much for taking part in today's roundtable. And for all the attendees, so we'll be forwarding on contact info for all of our panelists and presenters today should you want to have follow-up questions in the event that Matt or others can't stay with us for the duration of the call. So Matt, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. I want to move on to our next panel presenter, David Reidmiller. David has a lot of history working on climate change, but I want to specifically mention that he's currently the acting director of the Northeast and Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Centers, which are 2 of the 8 regional centers that form the National and Regional Climate Adaptation Science Network. Prior to taking on that role, David was detailed to the U.S. Global Change Research Program at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where he served as the director of the 4th National Climate Assessment. So David, a real treat to have you on with us today for this final installment of this NCA4 Roundtable series. We've given you presenter role. Go ahead and take it at your leisure.
Great, thanks, Larry. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay and see my slides. And just a huge thanks to the folks at the Park Service for putting on this this webinar series. From the NCA perspective, I can say that having folks like you on the receiving end showing this interest and taking on board the messages, it sort of validates the work of Ernesto and literally hundreds of other folks that volunteered for many years under my gentle prodding to deliver things. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my newer role, serving as the acting director of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center in the Department of the Interior. I got just a few slides that is going to highlight kind of a little bit about what the CASCs are, how we develop science priorities, and then kind of walk through just a couple brief examples of some of the work we've funded over the past few years relevant to both the Park Service as well, and specifically to the U.S. Caribbean. Oops, and my slides aren't advancing for some reason. Let's see. Okay. So I apologize if this is kind of old news for a lot of you, but the Climate Adaptation Science Centers were stood up a little over a decade ago, initially as a national center and then as 8 regional centers across the U.S. And their mission, broadly speaking, is to deliver actionable science to help fish, wildlife, and ecosystems adapt to a changing climate. So obviously we sit under the Department of the Interior, and so we certainly want to advance the mission of the Department of Interior. And we've been focusing, especially in the Southeast, a lot with our partnership in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and to an extent the Park Service as well, in addition to non-federal stakeholders, including state fish and wildlife agencies and other sort of natural resource managers. Our focus is really on impacts and adaptation, so advancing the understanding of climate impacts and land use impacts on natural resources, and also how managers can explore adaptation actions to help preserve, conserve, and restore some of those resources. So each regional task has a different process for developing their science priorities. Obviously, we are a stakeholder-driven, user-driven network, and we want to make sure that the science we are producing is responsive to the management needs of our stakeholders. And we do this through a variety of mechanisms I'll touch on a little bit in the next slide. But over the past 5 or 10 years or so, the outreach that we've done helped us sort of sculpt a science strategy that had 3 broad thrusts. The first is exposure, so improving the understanding of climate and land use processes and stressors on natural resources. So what are the risks that they face? Impacts, so how are the impacts from climate and land use on habitats, ecosystems, and species of conservation concern? And then finally on adaptation. So again, improving our partner understanding of and access to not just practical guidance, but also kind of the tools and data sets that help them make informed decisions. So again, thinking of exposure, impacts, and adaptation as sort of the 3 main thrusts of our prioritization. And we did this back in the U.S. Caribbean, I guess a couple of years ago, and last year we had, in collaboration with the Park Service and the USDA Climate Hub, we had a couple of listening sessions and then a workshop to inform our science priorities in both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And a number of kind of priorities came out, and they were echoed nicely in the presentations that Ernesto and Matt just gave. First and foremost, probably was the sea level rise component, and how that, as you saw quite vividly in Matt's presentation, how it's literally changing park boundaries and will continue to do so, and impacting cultural resources. The warming and acidification that's damaging marine ecosystems, in particular coral reefs, and what that means to coastal communities dependent on not just tourism from those marine ecosystems, but also the fisheries, obviously, which goes to the species migration component. And then as we get kind of more into the kind of societal sort of decision-making component of it, there's the idea of trying to mainstream climate or adaptation considerations into broader community development planning. And all of this is really kind of dependent on localized information. I think it was Ernesto that mentioned early on how obviously the spatial domain of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands is exceedingly small in the global landscape, and so trying to extract information from a global climate model that's of relevance to Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands can be particularly challenging. And so there's a real necessity for that sort of downscaled information, which comes with additional kind of caveats and consequences. That workshop that we held in the summer of 2018 was on ecological drought, but at that stage, this was a year after the 2017 hurricane season, and preparedness, response, and recovery was at the forefront of everyone's mind. And so it was sort of, I think, a broad theme, and one certainly that continues to persist today. So just walking through briefly some of the projects that we've funded over the past few years that relate both to the exposure, impacts, and adaptation component. I'll highlight just a couple of them, and I'll send the link, I'll put up the link at the end where you can go and explore a few more. But so much of our work in the U.S. Caribbean is driven by the downscale projections that we did initially. This first project led by Adam Toronto to look at future temperature and precipitation projections in Puerto Rico and
Hey, David, we seem to have lost your audio here. Can you hear me? Let's check this out. Looks like...
But then if you zoom in and look at sort of the climatology of precipitation across Puerto Rico by itself, you see extraordinary differences across the small spatial scale that is Puerto Rico, where it's quite dry on the southern coast, but 3 to 4 times greater precipitation when you get into the northeastern quadrant of the island. And so trying to understand those differences and how those and how climate change will manifest on those smaller spatial scales is incredibly important when you're talking about niche ecosystems and things like that. Another project that's somewhat unrelated, but obviously of great importance, again, building on what Ernesto said, is kind of the long-term urbanization trend and trying to inform how those land use changes may impact natural resource management. And again, that work was done a few years ago by Adam and some other folks, but we continue to look at a lot of urbanization work throughout the Southeast. On the impact side, I kind of chose two, both one kind of underwater and one sort of adjacent to the water. The first on warming and acidification on reef building corals. That again goes directly to some of the stuff that Matt was just talking about. We also looked at communicating future sea level rise scenarios for national wildlife refuge and national parklands. Work that's done by Mike Osland and Renee Collini, kind of a USGS and NOAA project. So again, trying to understand sort of the impacts of a changing climate on some of these highly exposed and highly vulnerable systems. And then on the adaptation front, there's some really interesting work that's a little more contemporary that has kind of built off one another, and it's really specific to Puerto Rico. And it started with that project on the bottom there with the implications for conservation of amphibians in tropical environments, and it became more kind of focused more recently with Jaime Colazo looking at the coqui frogs in Puerto Rico and how they are quite adapted to a very specific ecological regime and how the and we're trying to better understand not just the evolution of the landscape that they currently live in and where they may or may not be able to be relocated to, but also how the species themselves is evolving over time. So there's both a modeling and an in situ component to that works, that's looking at those questions. So with that, I'll just give a nod to the University Consortium that is our instrumental partner in this entire endeavor, hosted at NC State University, but with really valuable contributions from Duke, Auburn, University of Florida, South Carolina, and Tennessee as well. And I would encourage you to check out ccask.ncsu.edu to dig into any more of these projects in a bit more detail and a lot more. So with that, I'll pause and I guess see if there are any questions.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. And we're just going to move quickly on to Janet right now and then open it up for questions at the end. And we have some rolling in, so stick with us if you can. Well, the fact we've got so much work happening through the cast, not only in quantifying impacts, but also looking at on-the-ground adaptation efforts. So very cool. I want to introduce our final panelists here quickly. Janet Shakir holds a bachelor's and master's degree in geography from Radford University and Virginia Polytechnic and State University. Her PhD is in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management from North Carolina State University. Following her academic work, Janet focused on ways people were connected to the environment and exposed to air pollution, especially mercury, particulate matter, and ozone. She now works for the NPS, connecting parks with the science of climate change and identifying how future climate can change future risk to park resources. Janet, thank you so much for joining us today.
Janet, we cannot hear you. I think your phone's probably on mute.
You are an excellent detective there, Matt. Thanks. I was on mute, so I apologize. I'll be quick. We've only got a few minutes, but I wanted to give a little overview of how the Southeast region is working and collaborating with the Climate Change Response Program to respond to climate change. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So out of all of the parks in the Southeast region, we have 75% of them experiencing greater than the 95th percentile of their temperature range. So that's extremely warm. Out of all of our regional parks, 16% of them are in the 5th percentile for precipitation. If we use a time horizon of about 100 years, and 20% of them are experiencing extreme precipitation. So we have sort of both ends of that spectrum. Wanted to share with you a map of those extremely warm parks. These are parks where the past 10 to 30 years, mean temperatures have been in the 95th percentile of their historical range. And you can see that down here that the South Florida, Caribbean, Puerto Rico falls into that category. In the Park Service, we have a climate change response program that has 4 areas of emphasis: using science to help us manage, adapting to an uncertain future, reducing our carbon footprint, and educating about climate change. So a part of this webinar falls under some of that mission for the Climate Change Response Program, and we're very grateful that they organized this for us. The Climate Change Response Program actually asked the Southeast region to develop a regional climate action plan, and this was developed a few years ago. And we did some outreach to superintendents and to staff, and we gave all of the region a chance to comment on it. Really what evolved as really a grassroots kind of effort was 4 goals. 1, to develop a workforce informed about climate change. 2, to inspire visitors to action to address climate change, improve the Southeast region's environmental sustainability, and to manage resources in light of expected change. Under the current administration, all of these goals for our action plan and all of the goals for the climate change response plan's mission actually fall under the current Secretary Bernhardt's priorities. And I wanted to just give you some examples of those. One of his priorities is to promote the active management of our forests, and improve conditions and reduce wildfire risk, advance the economic security and environmental interests of the United States. And we just heard from our first presenter that the socioeconomics associated with climate change are highly relevant and important for the Southeast Caribbean, especially given the role that the corals play in supporting the fisheries and tourism. Expanding public access for sport and recreation opportunities on public lands. We have in a lot of our parks fishing, and we have commercial tour operators. Of course, our parks support tourism, and collaborating to protect and improve the North American wildlife conservation model, and continuing to move toward shared conservation stewardship. I think that the South Florida Caribbean area is an excellent example of ways that our parks and other agencies work across boundaries to accomplish larger goals. And supporting and implementing the Conservation Management and Recreation Act. I think all of these things are really important for the Caribbean, and they fall in line with our Secretary's priorities. So that's really good news. We only had an hour, but I wanted to make sure that I communicated those points and gave an opportunity for questions.
Thanks very much, Janet. Really appreciate it. And I think we can go over the hour a spell if we do have questions. I think everyone's good for it. And we did have one come in, so I just wanted to pitch it to the panel. It's to no one in particular, but the question is there interest in creating plans to move or remove infrastructure in vulnerable coastal areas to protect the marine environment as it overtakes some of the currently developed areas? Take a moment to chew on that. I wonder if there's any examples on the ground.
Any examples of infrastructure being moved? I can speak a little bit to that. In other areas in the Park Service, we've been exploring decision frameworks for adaptation choices, looking at the cost of adaptation. And this actually is a grant that was in collaboration with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, who David is a part of. We're looking at the cost of these adaptations and our budgets, and over a 30-year time horizon, what's the most economically valuable choice to preserve the maximum amount of our history over a 30-year time horizon. And that paper was published based on a case study of Portsmouth Village on Cape Lookout. And a new transferability study is just wrapping up, focused on Gulf Islands. But we did find that our methods are transferable from one park to another coastal park. And so we will be looking more at what we've learned. I think for me, and I think everybody who's involved in those projects maybe had a different learning. We learned so much from the projects. Each person sort of took something else away. I saw that probably the most frequently selected action was annual maintenance. And so, when you look at the coastal area and our mission, look at the priorities of the park, and if you want to maintain these historic structures in their locations, you really just have to maintain them consistently. However, as the ecosystem kind of moves and there becomes a conflict between the two, we really have to go back to what are our values, why is the park there, what's central to the mission of the park, and then make decisions if we have to. In other places, for example, in the state of North Carolina, as the beach moves, if there's someone who owns a home and the beach is moved under their home, most places are condemning the home even if it's still standing, with the water lapping under it. So I think different communities are currently developing policies that will provide guidance to make those decisions. For us and for the Park Service, we have to really fall back on what our foundation documents say, what our enabling legislation says, and really our values and why our park is there to make those choices.
And I will say, sometimes our hand is forced more than perhaps we'd like it to. We spent a lot of time talking during this presentation about Dorian and Irma and Maria and Harvey, and we need to recognize that those instances, when they hit us, far from a mandate to rebuild in kind, is an opportunity to rethink and relocate and potentially adapt accordingly. And so sometimes, rather than this long-range planning, we get opportunities that come unexpected, but are opportunities nonetheless.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you brought that up, Larry. Some of our senior leadership in the regional office are developing a storm response white paper, and so we'll be looking forward to seeing that when it comes out, and that will also help provide some guidance, I'm sure.
Excellent. We've got Matt.
I was just curious to see if our other panelists wanted a chance to respond to that question as well.
Yeah.
And
it's okay if not.
It's all good.
I'll just say some of that is a bit outside the remit of the typical work of the CASC. One thing I will say is that such decisions, I think, as Janet rightfully pointed out, are really value-laden decisions, and I think folks need to really assess that. And frankly, it can be a multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency process that is, for anybody that's engaged in those, knows that they're oftentimes can be quite cumbersome, and so starting that conversation early is certainly important.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right now we're in the middle of that process, and the discussions have been centered around issues such as gentrification and social justice, environmental justice, because in many cases, neighborhoods or urbanizations that have the means to stay there may kind of invest into adapting. On the other hand, based on the methods to assess benefits and costs, maybe retreat be the option, but in some cases then those areas are redeveloped and not for those people that used to dwell there, and just basically it creates this dilemma of communities trying to fight to stay at the place where for generations they have lived, but at the risk of being affected by floods and the same type of impacts associated to hurricanes, or give up and retreat, but then to see their former beachfront areas or channel type of locations being redeveloped, and they have no access to what they lived there for generations. So that's all important issues to bear in mind.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'd like to, also reemphasize what Ernesto was mentioning, is that, it also often has to do, if we look broadly across the landscape, with who owns that property, who's the steward. But the interesting thing is, who's the steward of our ecosystem services? And where's the voice that speaks to that? So as you have these gentrified neighborhoods that may be able to adapt at the detriment of an ecosystem that's trying to move, who pays? And that's going to be something that we'll look for in the future.
If I can just add one other point on this, not to belabor the question, but I was struck by one of the slides that Ernesto showed, where it showed like a 97% attenuation of the waves based on the reef infrastructure. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't just emphasize how important not just reefs, but also mangroves and other natural coastal systems are in sort of providing that protection. And I raise that because as these processes take time to sort of work with other landowners and identify what the options are, by bolstering and restoring those sort of natural coastal buffers, you can buy yourself time as you explore other options. So it's really important to do that.
No doubt about it. A lot at play, and as you said, David, everything we've talked about here is so value-laden that it's an interesting world to operate in. It is, by my clock, 10 minutes past the hour. I want to thank all of our attendees for hanging in here with us, thank all our panelists. I think we've reached the end of our time at this point. If you'd like to continue the discussion, we invite you to follow up with each and every one of the presenters and panelists as appropriate. They've graciously agreed to share their contact information, and we're willing to follow up on any additional questions. So we'd like to extend our sincere gratitude and appreciation to our presenters and panelists today, as well as those who have worked behind the scenes to bring you this broadcast. Just as soon as this broadcast is over, a pop-up will appear requesting your response in a very brief survey. Please do take a moment to fill it out. Your responses help improve each and every one of these offerings. In the days ahead, you can also expect to receive a follow-up email from me with links to the recorded webinar and contact information for all our presenters and panelists. As a reminder, this was the final installment of our roundtables in the NCA4 series. Recordings of this and all past installments in the series can be found at the link that we're going to share with you again now in the chat box. So thank you all very much for joining us today for the roundtable. We hope you continue to address climate change challenges in your parks on a daily basis. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.